This is an ad by BetterHelp. BetterHelp recently surveyed over 16,000 people and found that while 75% of people believe it's wise to seek support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy, and people stay silent to avoid being judged. BetterHelp has over 10 years of experience matching you with the right therapist. Because we're all better with help. Visit betterhelp.com/stopthestigma for their first ever State of Stigma report, the latest in mental health research.
Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through the cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but they have left the public divided. These aren't your typical cut and dried cases, guys. These are the ones where the facts might be clear, but the truth, that's another story. Because of their nature, these cases are difficult to decide. They leave people at odds with each other. The court has made its ruling, but what do you think? Today, we'll be diving into a case that has sparked endless debate. So listen closely, and by the end of the episode, you will have the chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served, or is there more to the story? This case explores the tragic death of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., a retired Marine and former corrections officer. Kenneth was a 68-year-old man living in White Plains, New York, and like many people his age, he had medical concerns. To ensure his safety, he wore a medical alert pendant, one that he could activate for emergency help if he needed it. On the early morning of November 19 in 2011, that device, it was accidentally triggered, sending an alert to LifeAid, a medical monitoring company. Now, when that team could not confirm Kenneth's safety, they called emergency services to perform a welfare check. And when police officers arrived at Kenneth's apartment, they knocked on his door, announcing their presence and asking him to open up so they can make sure he's all right. But Kenneth, reportedly startled awake, refused to let them in, insisting he was fine and he hadn't called for assistance. But despite his reassurances, the officers did not leave. They were not convinced. Instead, they pressed on, stating they were concerned for his safety. And over the next hour, the encounter grew tense, as Kenneth became increasingly adamant that he did not want or need their help. The police, however, they felt that Kenneth's behavior signaled that something was wrong, and they decided to force entry, arguing this was necessary to check on his well-being. When they finally break in, this situation escalates fast, leading to a confrontation that ended with Kenneth being fatally shot. The officers later claimed they acted in self-defense, while Kenneth's family and advocates argue that this was a tragic case of excessive force and a failure to de-escalate. So, was this an unfortunate outcome of a difficult situation, or was this an avoidable tragedy? As we explore this case in depth, consider what justice means in this context and whether the actions taken were truly justified. This is a sensitive case. As we move into the complexities of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr.'s case, a powerful question arises. Did the officer's actions truly meet the threshold of self-defense, or was this a tragic misuse of force? This question remains central, drawing us into a debate over police conduct, the appropriate use of force, and the responsibilities officers have to approach each welfare check with care, especially when dealing with vulnerable individuals. This is not simply a story about a tragic death. This is about how a series of decisions spiraled into an irreversible outcome, sparking debate that still resonates today. The events of November 19, 2011 began with a simple signal, an accidental activation of Kenneth Chamberlain's LifeAid alert. He's a 68-year-old retired Marine and former corrections officer, and he wore this device to protect himself if his health conditions ever posed a serious risk. However, on that morning, the alert device was triggered unintentionally, sending out a call that would draw law enforcement to his home. The LifeAid operator attempted to reach Kenneth to confirm his status, but when they were unable to get a response, they followed standard procedure and they reached out to local emergency services for a welfare check. This is standard. This should have been a straightforward safety measure, a routine check meant to ensure Kenneth's health and security. Yet, as officers arrived, Kenneth's night took an unexpected, ultimately tragic turn. When police officers reached Kenneth's door, they knocked, identified themselves, and requested entry to confirm his well-being. By then, Kenneth was reportedly awake and aware of their presence. Confused and likely startled from sleep, he responded through the door, stating, hey, he hadn't called for help, and he insisted that he was fine. But his words that he's fine did not end this interaction. The officers insisted on entry, expressing concern for his safety. A concern that, according to the officers, grew stronger with each minute that Kenneth refused to comply. So you're worried about someone and they won't let you in. This can get confusing. Their care, are they okay, or do they have a right to be left alone? For Kenneth, what started as a bewildering inconvenience soon turned into a frightening ordeal. He repeatedly stated that he did not need assistance, but those seemed to go unheard as the officers continued their attempts to enter. And at some point, Kenneth reportedly called his family, voicing his fear and confusion, questioning why police officers were at his door when he hadn't requested any help. Kenneth's family later argued that this reaction was completely understandable for a man of his age who was alone facing this unexpected intrusion. And they maintained that Kenneth's age and his status as a former corrections officer and his overall health condition should have prompted a more compassionate approach. But in those tense moments, the officers interpreted Kenneth's behavior differently. In their minds, his refusal to cooperate raised red flags, signaling that something could be seriously wrong. The pivotal question here is how this situation evolved from a welfare check into a fatal encounter. Kenneth's refusal to open the door was perceived by the officers as a possible indicator of a deeper issue, perhaps a mental health crisis or an emergency requiring immediate intervention. But from Kenneth's perspective, he was a man in his own home, facing what he saw as an unreasonable demand for entry. His resistance, his words, and even his warnings that he had a weapon, all of which were later shown to be untrue, paint a picture of a man feeling cornered, desperate, his natural defenses heightened. And yet for the officers, each statement from behind that door intensified their concern. The question deepens when we consider the dynamics of Kenneth's identity. Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. He was a black man, and the responding officers were white. Many have argued that this racial difference may have played a role in how the officers assessed and responded to his behavior. Advocates point to a broader trend, one that sees interactions between black men and law enforcement escalate more often and more severely than in other demographics. They argue that in cases like Kenneth's, racial bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can impact an officer's perception of the threat level, altering how they interpret a person's words, actions, and intentions. Kenneth's family and supporters suggest that had the officers approached the situation differently, with awareness of Kenneth's race and his vulnerability, this outcome might have been very different. But then there's law enforcement, and they hold a different view and argue they were simply doing their job. They were responding to a welfare check, a call to make sure that someone was all right. And this call turned out to be anything but routine. In their statements, they indicated that Kenneth's refusal to comply His statements about having a weapon and his unpredictable behavior left them with limited options. According to the police narrative, they were obligated to ensure his safety. But Kenneth's repeated refusals presented a serious challenge. From their perspective, they first attempted, less lethal measures. They used a taser, beanbag rounds, before resorting to lethal force as a last option. In their view, these actions represented appropriate escalation given the perceived threat and Kenneth's lack of cooperation. It's within this space of conflicting perspectives that we must examine the concept of self-defense. Self-defense, as law enforcement understands it, is grounded in the belief that officers have the right to protect themselves from potential harm, especially in unpredictable situations.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. BetterHelp recently surveyed over 16,000 people and found that while 75% of people believe it's wise to seek support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy, and people stay silent to avoid being judged. BetterHelp has over 10 years of experience matching you with the right therapist, because we're all better with help. Visit betterhelp.com/stopthestigma for their first ever State of Stigma report, the latest in mental health research.
This seems fair. Now, in Kenneth's case, the officers argue they were defending themselves from what they saw as a credible threat. But for Kenneth's family, this raises painful questions. Was Kenneth truly a danger to these officers, or was he a man in distress whose actions were misinterpreted as aggressive? Did Kenneth's refusal to comply truly warrant the escalating force that followed? This situation is not unique, but it does highlight the difficult decisions officers do face during welfare checks. These are done every day around the world, and the critical question of how they assess threats in high-stress situations. Advocates suggest that Kenneth's situation could have been handled by first responders trained in de-escalation, or perhaps even a mental health professional. The escalation in this case, they argued, reflects a deeper problem in police practices that often prioritize compliance over context. Do what you're told in order over what's actually going on in front of you. Now, Kenneth's age, his background, his race, each of these elements might have informed a different response. One focused on calming this person, not confronting them. The final point of debate remains clear, okay? Where does the line fall between self-defense and excessive force? And can we make a determination when people didn't have all of the information? Where does the line fall in cases involving welfare checks and vulnerable individuals? Kenneth didn't have a weapon, but in the heat of the moment, his statements and behavior suggested otherwise. Was this then an honest mistake, a tragic outcome of a difficult situation? Or was it a failure of protocol, an instance of power misused under the guise of protection? As we go through this, all right, keep these questions in mind. This case forces us to consider the choices made by both the officers and Kenneth himself, the biases that might have influenced these choices, and the systems in place that allowed this encounter to escalate as it did. Was justice served in this case, or does Kenneth's death point to a deeper issue or issues that need addressing? All right, let's get into what happened here. On November 19th in 2011, Kenneth was in his apartment in White Plains, New York, following his normal routine. He was a retired Marine, like I said, a former corrections officer, and he lived alone and was familiar with the protocols around personal safety and caution. At 68, he faced ongoing health challenges, prompting him to wear that medical alert pendant provided by Life Aid. This medical device was intended as a safety net, a lifeline to summon emergency services in the event of a crisis. However, that morning, this device was activated accidentally, and it sent an alert signal that Kenneth didn't even mean to send, one that he wasn't okay. LifeAid, receiving the alert, tried to reach Kevin, of course, by phone to verify whether he really did need assistance. And when he didn't respond to this contact, they followed their established protocol and called emergency services. Their request was simple: perform a welfare check to ensure Kenneth's safety. For LifeAid, this was just routine. Make sure Kenneth is all right. But as police prepared to enter Kenneth's world that morning, the stage was unknowingly set for a tragic encounter that would end in a way that no one could have predicted. Shortly before 5 a.m., the White Plains Police Department dispatched officers to Kenneth's apartment to follow up on the welfare check. Their goal was to verify his condition and ensure he was not in immediate danger. For the officers, this was a protocol-driven task, one that often involved minimal interaction. But Kenneth's response to the officers' presence was not what they expected. He was asleep when they got there, and upon hearing the knocks at his door, expressed confusion. From his perspective, there was no emergency. He hadn't called for help, and he didn't understand why the officers were there at his door. When they knocked and identified themselves, the officers, Kenneth spoke to them through the door, informing them he's fine, he didn't request assistance. This initial communication reflected Kenneth's belief that the matter would be resolved quickly. However, as the officers persisted, the situation started to feel less routine to Kenneth. What began as a simple knock at the door soon took on a more ominous tone. Kenneth's statements that he did not need help seemed to fall on deaf ears as the officers continued pressing for entry. With every minute that passed, the atmosphere grew more tense, creating a standoff that was about to take a dark turn. For Kenneth, each repeated knock and request for entry felt increasingly invasive. From his perspective, he was safe in his home, and he could not understand why the officers refused to leave. In those moments, Kenneth may have felt that his personal boundaries were being violated, leading to frustration and possibly fear. The seeds of misunderstanding were planted, creating a divide between Kenneth's perception of the situation and the officers' growing concerns on their side. For Kenneth, it seemed that his explanations would never be enough. Meanwhile, the officers faced an unresolved welfare check, complicated by Kenneth's resistance, prompting them to consider their next steps. Now, as the officers remained outside Kenneth Chamberlain Sr.'s apartment, their concerns started to shift. Welfare checks like these typically involve minimal resistance. It's either a simple check-in, at most, maybe minor reluctance. But Kenneth's, he continued to just refuse to open the door even. It created a sense of urgency for the officers. They don't want something to happen under their watch. They're there to make sure everything is okay. And they start to interpret Kenneth's behavior as a possible sign of underlying trouble. To the police, Kenneth's insistence that he was fine, it didn't provide enough reassurance. In fact, they grew increasingly wary, wondering if there was more going on inside the apartment than he was letting on. Kenneth, however, was growing more agitated by the minute. What had started as a confusing intrusion now felt to him like an alarming insistence on entry. His prior experience in the Marine Corps and his years as a corrections officer may have influenced his response as he attempted to assert his own control over the situation he felt spiraled out of his hands. He reiterated his stance that he did not need help, and he urged the officers to leave him alone. But despite these reassurances, the police did not back down. The longer Kenneth resisted, the more the officers' perception of risk seemed to increase. They began questioning why he was so determined to keep them out if he was indeed safe. Why? Was he trying to hide something? Was there a medical or psychological issue that he wasn't able or unwilling to disclose? According to later statements by police, they interpreted his response, these responses, as possibly indicative of a more complex crisis, because it was confusing to them on their side as well. In their eyes, Kenneth's repeated refusals suggested potential distress that required their intervention, even if he didn't want it. Kenneth's frustration escalated to the point that he issued warnings to the officers. And at one point, he told them he was armed, claiming he had a weapon, though he didn't follow through with any threatening action. His words intensified the officers' perception of the situation. This claim about a weapon, whether a defensive response or an attempt to deter their entry, became a pivotal moment in this entire incident. Police officers are trained to respond cautiously to any mention of weapons, and Kenneth's statement immediately heightened the tension. The officers responded by warning Kenneth about the potential consequences of his statements, and they asked him to open the door so they can just make sure he's safe. As both sides dug in, the dynamic changed from a welfare check to a standoff. The police saw Kenneth's resistance and statements as signs of potential risk, while Kenneth likely viewed their persistence as an unwanted invasion. This misunderstanding would soon lead to drastic measures as the officers decide to force entry into Kenneth's apartment. As the standoff persisted, the officers ultimately decided to take action. With no resolution in sight and perceiving Kenneth's words as increasingly erratic and offensive, they made the call to force entry into his apartment. To the police, this decision was justified, an attempt to fulfill their responsibility to verify his safety and well-being. But to him, this forced entry represented a boundary being crossed, an unwarranted intrusion to his personal space, and it escalated his fear and agitation. So when police break through the door, the encounter took on a whole new and more volatile dimension. Kenneth, he's already on edge. He reacts strongly to their entry. According to officers' accounts, he appeared defensive and aggressive, possibly interpreting the forced entry as a direct threat. In the changed environment where each side felt justified in its stance, both Kenneth and the officers seemed to be operating under heightened stress and suspicion, making any attempt at calm communication increasingly difficult. Reports suggest that as officers entered, Kenneth moved toward them. Whether his actions were defensive or viewed as aggressive, the officers saw his movement as a potential threat. Their previous warnings about his statements regarding a weapon lingered in their minds. At this point, the tension's high, the officers' training likely dictated an instinctive response to perceived aggression. Their first approach to subduing him was to use non-lethal methods, which included using the taser to immobilize Kenneth. However, the taser didn't have the desired effect, and Kenneth continued to react, heightening the officer's perception of a risk. The situation rapidly escalates as the taser proved ineffective, really. And in response, the officers employed beanbag rounds, another non-lethal method intended to subdue without causing any harm. Beanbag rounds, though designed to incapacitate, can be disorienting and painful, adding to the tension of an already intense situation. But Kenneth, possibly further agitated by these methods, he didn't respond as expected. Whether he was in pain, disoriented, or simply reacting to what he viewed as an assault, his resistance only seemed to confirm the officer's view of him as a direct threat. Now, at this stage, the officers faced a critical decision point. They had attempted verbal commands, a taser, beanbag rounds, yet Kenneth's reaction persisted. They interpreted his continued resistance as an immediate danger, leaving them in their view with no choice but to employ lethal force. And it was then, in the final moments of this encounter, that live ammunition was used, resulting in Kenneth Chamberlain Sr.'s death. The aftermath of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr.'s death left a profound impact, not only on his family, but on the broader community and nation. News of the incident spread quickly, sparking immediate public outcry and raising questions about police protocols, especially during welfare checks involving elderly or vulnerable individuals. Kenneth's family, devastated by the loss, sought answers, demanding to know why a welfare check, a safety measure meant to protect him, had led to such a tragic outcome. Kenneth's son, Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., became a vocal advocate, pressing for accountability and transparency. He questioned the necessity of the force used, especially given his father's age, his health conditions, and the fact that he was unarmed. For the Chamberlain family, this tragedy was not simply one about life lost. It was about a broader issue, the responsibility of law enforcement to assess each situation with care, particularly when vulnerable individuals are involved. Let's remember there was a wall, a door in between these two people in the beginning. That can't make it easy for both sides, right? For either side, they had no idea what was on the other side. That makes it tough. Now we have the police department side, right? They maintain that their actions were in line with protocol, and they emphasized the unpredictable nature of the encounter and their perceived need to defend themselves. They argued that the methods they used, beginning with verbal commands, escalating to non-lethal force, and only resorting to lethal force when they believed there was an imminent threat, they were all consistent with their training. The officers involved in this case stated that Kenneth's behavior had left them with few options, and they underscored that their primary goal had been to ensure public and officer safety. Public response to Kenneth's death highlighted deep divisions over police practices, especially in situations involving mental health and elderly citizens and people of color. Many community members and advocates pointed to Kenneth's race as a potential factor in the escalation, arguing that a black man's resistance to police commands is often interpreted as aggression, regardless of context. This perspective fueled calls for reform, advocates pushing for change of how law enforcement approaches welfare checks, particularly for individuals who might be experiencing confusion, fear, or misunderstanding. The media coverage surrounding Kenneth's case intensified scrutiny on police practices. Audio recordings captured by Life Aid, which recorded portions of the interaction, played a significant role in shaping public opinion. Hearing Kenneth's pleas and expressions of fear created a visceral connection to his final moments, making it very difficult for many to view the incident in purely procedural terms. The recordings underscored the emotional weight of the encounter and for many solidified the perception that this tragedy could have been prevented. In the wake of Kenneth's death, advocacy groups began calling for increased training for handling welfare checks, arguing police need specialized training on mental health issues. Kenneth's case was emblematic for them of a larger issue within law enforcement. The legal proceedings that followed were also complex. Kenneth's family pursued civil action alleging that his death was the result of excessive force and a failure to de-escalate. They sought to hold the officers in the department accountable, arguing that the approach taken had been unnecessarily aggressive from the outset. In response, the police defended their actions, pointing to the perceived threats and the methods they claimed were consistent with standard procedure. Kenneth Chamberlain Sr.'s story became more than a singular tragedy. It evolved into a case study in the ongoing debate over police reform, accountability, and the need for change in how law enforcement handles situations involving vulnerable individuals. As the case moved through the courts and into public consciousness, it left a lasting impression on many, calling the attention to the vital need for clarity and compassion and caring judgment in every aspect of policing. When Kenneth Chamberlain's case was examined in court, the prosecution's argument focused heavily on the idea that law enforcement's response was unnecessarily forceful, and it failed to account for his specific situation. The prosecution argued that Kenneth's age and health and known vulnerability should have influenced the officer's approach from the very beginning. From their perspective, this incident was a tragic case of overreach, where the officer's persistence escalated a welfare check into a fatal confrontation. According to the prosecution, Kenneth's initial resistance was misinterpreted by the officers. The argument was that law enforcement in this instance misread the context entirely. Kenneth's statements and refusal to open the door, they were not acts of aggression, they claimed, but rather a reflection of his confusion and growing fear. Given his age and health concerns, the prosecution asserted that Kenneth's resistance was understandable. Key to their case was the argument that alternative methods could have been employed, especially in the context of a welfare check. They argued that officers should have been equipped to understand that Kenneth's behavior likely stemmed from distress rather than defiance. The prosecution proposed that Kenneth's verbal resistance was, in fact, a cry for understanding. It was not an indication of aggression. Had the officers paused to assess the situation from this perspective, they might have avoided further escalating the conflict. This misinterpretation of Kenneth's actions, according to the prosecution, laid the foundation for the tragic outcome. Moreover, they criticized the tactics the officers used. They placed emphasis on the role that implicit bias might have played. He was a black man. They argued that Kenneth's refusal to open the door might have been viewed differently if he were not black. In their view, Kenneth's death overall was the result of excessive force applied to a situation that called for patience and understanding and compassion. And they argued that if law enforcement had approached Kenneth with de-escalation tactics rather than confrontation, he might still be alive today. But of course, we have the defense. And they argued that the officers' actions were reasonable given these circumstances, emphasizing they had to make very quick, we're talking microseconds, instinctive decisions under pressure. The defense painted a picture of a volatile and unpredictable situation in which Kenneth, his behavior, it was interpreted as erratic and potentially dangerous. From the defense's perspective, each step taken by the officers, from attempting verbal commands to using non-lethal force, was a measured approach aimed at ensuring public safety and their own. The defense maintained that the officers were following standard procedure for a welfare check, but found themselves met with resistance and eventually what they perceived as aggression. For the defense, Kenneth's mention of a weapon was pivotal, as it set the tone for what they believed to be a potentially dangerous encounter. He had made the statement. Additionally, the defense underscored the steps officers took before resorting to lethal force. They pointed to the non-lethal options, the tasers, the beanbags. Those were evidence of restraint, and in their view, these steps demonstrated the officers' attempt to resolve the situation without having to escalate. They also addressed the officers' judgment and perception of risk during the encounter and argued that welfare checks, though routine, they can take unexpected turns, and officers need to be ready. It can change when an individual's uncooperative or if they make threats. And in Kenneth's case, they contended his behavior gave the impression of a potential mental health crisis, which added another layer of unpredictability to the situation. And they suggested that Kenneth's age and background as a former Marine and corrections officer may have contributed to his resistance and warnings of a weapon, making it difficult for officers to assess whether he was acting out of fear or anger or aggression. As the trial progressed, both arguments are laid out, and the public response to this case stayed deeply divided. Supporters of Kenneth's family aligned with the prosecution's stance, saying, hey, the incident represented an unavoidable tragedy fueled by excessive force and a failure to approach the situation with empathy. For these supporters, Kenneth's age and health and mental state were all factors that should have signaled the need for a more sensitive response. They argued that law enforcement's reliance on standard procedures rather than adjusting their tactics for the situation, a vulnerable individual, an elderly individual, underscored a lack of training and an over-reliance on force. For advocates of reform, this case became emblematic of a broader issue. Conversely, supporters of the officers aligned with the defense's view, asserting that actions taken during the encounter were reasonable under the circumstances. They pointed to an inherent unpredictability of welfare checks overall, particularly when officers face resistance and potential threats. In their opinion, the officers had adhered to protocol, exercising restraint. They did employ non lethal methods. They did try to talk him down. Supporters argue that in any high stress situation, officers have to prioritize their safety, especially when verbal threats of weapons are involved. These opposing reactions reflected broader societal tensions. The arguments presented on both sides left a lasting impression, sparking discussions on law enforcement's ability, the accountability of police, the balance between self defense and excessive force, and the importance of de escalation training. As this case moved through the courts and into the public eye, it became more than just a legal debate. It turned into a catalyst for ongoing conversations about the need for reform and the complexities of policing in today's society. Highlighted in the controversy, okay, Kenneth was a black man. He's in his late 60s. He's alone in his apartment facing multiple white officers demanding entry. This has to elicit a response that people just can't be ready for. You do not know how someone is going to respond when they feel like Kenneth felt that day. Another key aspect of the controversy surrounding this death centers on the role of mental health and the nature of these welfare checks. Kenneth was not in an obvious state of mental distress when officers arrived, but his accidental alert set in motion a series of assumptions and decisions. And one of the most compelling aspects of the Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. case is the presence of audio recordings, which captured part of the interaction between Kenneth and the officers. Recorded by LifeAid's monitoring system, these clips reveal Kenneth's pleas. Definitely something helping out Kenneth's case. For Kenneth's family and supporters, these recordings underscore their belief that he was not aggressive, but that he was scared. A lot's going on in this case. And now that we've explored the details, the arguments, and controversies surrounding the death of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., it's time to consider your own perspective. This case touches on some of the most complex issues within law enforcement today: the appropriate use of force, the role of bias, the handling of welfare checks, and the level of compassion shown to vulnerable individuals in high-stress situations. For you, in considering all the questions surrounding this case, you may find yourself torn, understanding aspects of both Kenneth's and the officer's perspectives. But where does that leave the broader question of justice in this case? Was the officer's use of force justified? Was it? Or could the tragic outcome have been avoided? As you think about this case, consider what justice means to you. Should law enforcement be held to a higher standard of empathy and care, particularly during welfare checks? Or because of police ambushes and draws to people that want to kill them? Was their response in this case understandable given the uncertainties and risks involved with what Kenneth was saying and how he was acting? Cases like this remind us that the line between self-defense and excessive force is not always clear-cut, and that every action has profound consequences. So as we conclude this episode, I invite you to weigh the facts and the arguments carefully. Was Kenneth's death an unfortunate but justified outcome in a high-risk situation? Or does his story highlight the need for reform in law enforcement practices? Or are these situations just so unpredictable, there is no right side? In the court of public opinion, you have the power to form your own opinion. Was justice truly served? Or is there more to the story? Thank you for joining me on True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Until next time, stay safe out there, guys. Remember to keep questioning the stories that shape our world. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.